Okay. I belong to the Rotary Club of York, and the Rotary motto is service above self. It's not on, that's why. That's better. I belong to the Rotary Club of York, and the Rotary Club motto is service above self. On our website it says, we believe in having fun, but also in service above self, giving back something to our community and making a difference. I think that's a good attitude to have. It doesn't say we've got to be serious and worthy all the time while we're serving. It says we believe in having fun. And surely that's a good motto, attitude and lifestyle for all Christians to have as well. I'm sure that Jesus had time off with his disciples as well, and he was such a good example of service to other people. And this chapter in Philippians is a challenge to us all, but it's also so encouraging. If Jesus Christ, who is God, was willing to come down to earth for us, was willing to die upon the cross for us, and in the process was willing to serve, so that we might have a good example to follow and to serve, how can we sit on our high horses and wait to be served by others? I think this chapter breaks into the 3 chapters it's got into in the Bible. And the first 11 verses are, of course, about imitating Christ's humility. So let's start at the beginning. When we begin to work for others, when we begin to care for others as if they were our problems, then we begin to just demonstrate Christ's example of putting others first, and we begin to experience real unity. Sadly, many people, even Christians, live only to make a good impression on others or to please themselves. But selfish ambition or vain conceit can only bring discord. Paul stressed that spiritual unity was the answer, asking the Philippians to love one another and to be one in spirit and purpose. We should not be so concerned about making a good impression on others or meeting our own needs that we restrain the relationship in God's family. When I was preparing for this, I read that selfish ambition can ruin the church, but genuine humility can build it. And I was struck by that, and it's true, isn't it? And when I talked about humility, I'm not talking about humiliation. When I talk about humble, I'm not talking about becoming a doormat for other people. It does not mean that we need to put ourselves down. Now, we're quite good about that, but it doesn't mean that at all. Yes, before God we're sinners and we're saved only by God's grace. However, we are saved. Once you know Jesus, we are saved. And therefore we have great worth in God's kingdom. But it means that we need to lay aside our own selfishness and treat others with respect and common courtesy. And when we begin to consider other people's interests as more important than our own, we find we're linked more and more with Christ as a true example of humility. And when we think that unity is hard to obtain, when we look at all of us and the different backgrounds we come from, different cultures and different ways of life, how can we work together in unity? But look at that church in Philippi. It was a great cosmopolitan city with people from many diverse backgrounds and they were working together in real unity. And that's what we're being encouraged today. Although there's no evidence of division in the church, nevertheless, its unity, like ours, has to be safeguarded. And Paul was encouraging them to guard against selfishness, prejudice or jealousy, because that might lead to dissension. And the same message is true for us today. When we begin to show a genuine interest in other people, we find that we're taking a step forward in maintaining our unity amongst our fellow believers. Jesus Christ was the perfect example of how to be a humble human being. He was willing to give up all his rights in order to serve God and to serve people. And like Christ, we too should have a serving attitude. But we need to serve out of love for others, not out of guilt or fear. Remember, you can choose your attitude and how you work. You can approach life expecting to be served, or you can look for opportunity to serve others. One of the best examples I ever had was with Bill Munsey, my training vicar in Morden. Many of you met him when he came to celebrate with us a few weeks ago for my celebration. Now, we had a special school in our parish, and Bill used to go there regularly for assemblies every week. But we had 3 different special assemblies in church every year. In October it was harvest, in December it was Christmas, and March or April it was Easter. Now, the reason I remember those services so well was the refreshments afterwards. The services were lovely, and we sat back and we watched the children act out their parts and listened to the stories, but it was the refreshments that stuck in my mind though. At harvest it was biscuits, mince pies at Christmas, and hot cross buns at Easter. They were all eaten in the hall beside the church and trodden in the carpet as well. And afterwards, Bill and I used to decide whose turn it was to use a knife to scrape up the bits out the carpet, and who followed with the hoover to get it all up. That was one of the greatest tests of humility for me when we started doing that, but also one of the times we usually had a great laugh while we were doing it. We couldn't ask the teachers and the helpers to help us. They had to look after the children and get them back to school, and that left us. And as I say, I can always remember the different refreshments at different times of year. Bill was another good example of humility in other ways. Whenever we had a social in our hall, which we did regularly, and it involved food, which he did regularly, he was usually one of the first ones in the kitchen afterwards, helping with the washing up. Whatever we do, let us do it out of love for others, because we want to help them and we want to serve them, not out of duty begrudgingly and for our own ambition. Now in verse 6, we come and we read about the incarnation of Jesus. This is what we call the act of Christ, because he was already the Son of God before he became a human being. And he voluntarily assumed a human body and a human nature. Without ceasing to be God, he also became a human being, the man called Jesus. He didn't give up his deity to become a human, but he set aside his rights to his glory and his power. And in real submission to the Father's will, Christ limited his power and knowledge. On earth, Jesus of Nazareth was subject to place, time, and many other human limitations, just as we are. What made his humanity unique, though, was his freedom from sin. In his full humanity, Jesus showed us everything about God's character that can be conveyed in human terms. And verses 5 to 11 in this passage were probably sung as a hymn in those days. And I've actually sung a hymn to this words, once at Holy Trinity Brompton in London. It was absolutely brilliant. And I can remember coming out of the church just glowing with the joy of Jesus was not being in a very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing. And often people excuse selfishness, pride, or evil by claiming their rights. We've heard them. It's my right to do this. It's my right to do that. And what about my rights? And as Paul's showing us, as believers though, we need to put aside these thoughts and have a different attitude. One that enables us to lay aside our rights in order to serve others. If we say we follow Christ, then we must also say that we want to live as he lived. So we need to develop his attitude of humility as we serve, even if we are unlikely to get recognition in the process. Jesus was so humble that he was willing to die for us. And he was so obedient to God that he was willing to die in that terrible way on a cross. So how can we, with that picture in our minds, jump up and down, demanding our rights, our place in society? And thankfully it didn't stop there, because in return God exalted him to the highest place to sit at his right hand. And every one of us will at some point have to stand in front of him as he questions us about our place in society and the way we've served our fellow human beings and him. What will we be able to say? How can we face him, Lord of Lords and King of Kings? He set us such a great example. What else can we do but serve him as willingly and humbly as he did? So we get to the second part. You'll be glad to know I'm not going to be as long with these two parts. And the second part in my Bible is called Shining as Stars. I like that. Shining as Stars. And it starts off with, therefore, my dear friends. So it ties in this passage with the one before it. Paul is encouraging the entire church to work together to preserve the unity they had when he was with them. He knew they had to be especially careful to obey Christ now that Paul was no longer with them. And we have to be careful too. You know, there's times in our lives when we don't seem to have anyone that we can follow and do as we should do. And we have to live our lives and listen to God more and more. But what do we do at the times when we don't feel that we want to obey God? What do we do at the times when we think it's too hard to obey him and what he wants us to do? Well, God does not ever leave us on our own to flounder as we struggle to do his will. He wants to come alongside us and be within us in order to help us. God helps us to want to obey him. Then he gives us the power to do what he wants. And the secret is a changed life. One that's willing to submit to God's will and control and allow him to work in us. Next time you find that you're struggling to live as God wants you to live, ask him to help you to want to do his will. For to be like Christ means that we need to train ourselves to be more and more like him. To change our desires to be more like Christ, we need the power and to recognise the power of his indwelling spirit in us, the influence of faithful people, faithful Christians, and in order to be obedient to God's work and his sacrificial service. Often it's when we find ourselves doing God's will that we gain a desire to do it more. We need to learn to do what he wants us to do and trust him to change our desires to his. Now, we're also reminded that arguing and complaining in the church is so harmful. When people hear stories about church members arguing, complaining and gossiping about each other, they get a false impression of Christianity and the gospel we all want to follow. We should do our best not to argue with other Christians. I know it's hard at times. We need to do our best not to complain about people and conditions in the church. And the Pope himself, actually this week, was talking about how gossiping can be a real danger and a real hindrance to people when they hear it, especially amongst Christians. Because when we do that, it stops the world seeing Christ and the loving God he really is. Our lives should be characterised by moral purity, patience and peacefulness, so that we will all shine like stars in a dark and depraved world. I love that idea, that we shine like stars. A transformed life is a really effective witness to the power of God's words. Are you shining brightly, or are you still clouded a bit by complaining and arguing? Let us shine out for God. Paul was willing to do that and felt that even if he had to die, in the process, it was so worthwhile because he'd helped the Philippians live for Christ. I don't think we're usually called to die in the same way, in the same painful way, and go through the same suffering that Paul did. But whatever we're called to do for Christ, let's do it. And because we're totally committed to serving Christ, maybe even sacrificing our own wants and needs to build the faith up of others around us. Because we do find it brings us such a joyous reward. It just makes us feel so much better and things just get that much wonderful. So we come to the final part. And he's talking about his friends who were helping him out. It's so encouraging to realise that Paul was such a great apostle and evangelist, but he still needed friends to support him as well. And the first one mentioned here was Timothy. And he was in Rome with Paul when Paul wrote this letter. He had travelled with Paul on his second missionary journey when the church in Philippi was begun. And Paul valued Timothy because he knew he had a real interest in their growth and welfare, whereas a lot of other believers were more preoccupied in their own needs than to spend time working for Christ. And like Timothy, we need to make sure that we can find time in our busy schedules to make time for our Christian service and love for others. And Paul, like any skilled workman, was training Timothy like an apprentice so he could carry on his ministry in his absence. Who are we training to continue the work here when we're not able? Paul, at the time of writing this letter, was in prison, either awaiting his trial or its verdict, and he promised he would send Timothy to them with the result once he learned of the court's decision. Epaphroditus was the man who delivered the money from the Philippians to Paul to help him to continue in his work. And then he returned with this thank you letter to Philippi. Now, he may have been an elder in Philippi who, while staying with Paul, became ill. After he recovered, he returned home, and he's only mentioned this time in Philippians. These two men remind us that, like Paul, we all need friends and helpers to help us work together for Jesus. It's not often that we're sent out on our own. It's so much better to work together, supporting each other in many different ways. Finally, when we look at the world, it honours those who are intelligent, beautiful, rich and powerful. Our TV and our papers are full of them, aren't they? What kind of people should the church honour? Paul indicates we should honour those who give their lives for the sake of Christ, going where we cannot go ourselves. When we look, our missionaries do that for us today, by providing ministry where we're not able to go. So let us do our best to support them in every way possible. Financially, yes, and also prayerfully, so that we will do all in our power to help them in their vital service to Jesus. The other people I think we should honour are our ministers, Jeff and Glenda, because they too are making sacrifices to help us and to serve Christ. They need our friendship and support as well, so that they too will feel loved and cared for as they serve Christ here. When our new minister comes at the Baptist church, at the Methodist church, I hope we will support him as well and his family, so that he feels loved and cared for as he moves into the village. It's never easy to move to a new parish and become their ministers. I know I was always grateful for the friendship and support I was given in each of the parishes I served in. Ironically, the last one was in Durham, as I moved there on my own. That was very lonely for quite a while. Friendship needn't cost us anything but our time, yet it can be priceless, I can assure you. So whatever we do to serve others, let us do it willingly and lovingly, not out of duty, not because we have to, not because we ought to, but because we want to, and to serve and help our fellow human beings. As a church, let us work together peacefully and prayerfully, asking God to help us serve Him every step of the way. As I said, it may not be easy at times, but we ask Him to help us we find he gives us that inner strength to do it. Let Jesus Christ be our shining example so that we can be shining stars in this village with the people we work with, the communities we engage with. Let people see Christ's love shining out of this building and out of us so that they too will begin to want to know more about our faith and what it means to be a Christian. They want to know more about our God and our Saviour Jesus, and they too will want to become more and more like him, and so we can be shining examples of that to other people. And I pray we can manage that together. Amen.